charming, charismatic, and enigmatic. A skilled spy who remains emotionally reserved but is deeply loyal and protective of those he cares about, balancing his domineering nature with selflessness, showing a more vulnerable side to those he trusts. Jungkook quiet and reserved, with doe-like eyes that often seemed to hold more than he let on. Shy and observant, he preferred to keep to himself, but his loyalty to those close to him was unmatched. Though he often came across as timid, his determination to protect the ones he loved was steadfast, and he would go to great lengths for them. The city pulsed with life, its streets alive with the vibrant energy of neon lights and the constant hum of activity. In the heart of this chaos, Taehyung moved like a shadow, silent, calculating, and with a single mission in mind. As a spy for a covert organization, his life was a series of shadows and secrets, and today was no different. Beside him there was Jaemin, his loyal mission partner aka his soulmate. Jaemin wasn't technically part of this mission, but his skills in negotiation, charm, and infiltration made him an invaluable asset. As always, Jaemin was unfazed, his mischievous grin a constant reminder that the weight of the mission was never too heavy for him. Targets on the move, came the voice of their handler, Namjoon, through their earpieces. Got it, Taehyung replied, his eyes narrowing in concentration. His body shifted, his steps fluid and purposeful. They were tracking a rogue scientist, a man who had stolen classified information that could alter the balance of power in the world. It was their job to retrieve the data and make sure he vanished, no trace left behind. They arrived at the art gallery where the exchange was set to take place. The artist community was the perfect cover for their mission. The patrons in their expensive suits, the champagne flowing freely, the smooth jazz playing in the background, it all blended together, creating the perfect environment for a covert operation. Taehyung surveyed the room, his eyes scanning every face, every figure in the crowd. He had his eyes set on the target, but as he made his way toward him, something, or rather, someone caught his attention. It was a young artist. Jungkook stood beneath a spotlight, painting with an intense concentration that stole Taehyung's breath. His movements were graceful, his brush strokes fluid, as though the canvas was an extension of his soul. His doe-like eyes were fixed on his work, and for a moment, the noise and movement of the gallery faded into the background. Focus, V. Namjoon's voice crackled in his ear, pulling him out of his trance. Taehyung blinked, shaking his head. He couldn't afford distractions, but something about Jungkook's presence was magnetic. There was a mystery to the young man that piqued his curiosity, a mystery Taehyung couldn't ignore. After some time, the mission continued as planned. The target had been neutralized, the data secured, and the scientist was no longer a threat. Yet, even as Taehyung completed the mission, his mind kept drifting back to Jungkook. There was something about him that couldn't be explained. Taehyung had to know more. He found himself returning to the art gallery under the guise of an art enthusiast. The walls were lined with paintings, each one more breathtaking than the last, but it was Jungkook's work that drew him in. His paintings were raw, emotional, and hauntingly beautiful, each stroke telling a story that seemed to reach into Taehyung's very core. Jaemin had disappeared into the crowd by this point, likely gathering intel in his own playful, charming way. Taehyung, however, couldn't bring himself to leave the gallery without speaking to Jungkook. Your work is stunning, Taehyung said as he approached the artist, his voice smooth but genuine. Jungkook looked up, startled, and their eyes met. Taehyung was struck by the intensity in Jungkook's gaze, the vulnerability that flickered behind his stoic expression. Thank you, Jungkook replied softly. It's just something I felt like creating. Taehyung's lips curved into a slight smile. It's more than that. It's raw. You've captured emotions most people can't even express. Jungkook blushed, clearly flustered by the compliment. You have a good eye. Before Taehyung could respond, a commotion near the entrance caught his attention. A patron was arguing with security, but it was a minor issue, nothing that required his immediate involvement. I should go, Taehyung said reluctantly, but I'd love to see more of your work. Jungkook hesitated before pulling out a small card and handing it to him. "Here's my studio's address. Come by sometime." Their fingers brushed briefly as Taehyung took the card. He glanced down at the card and then back at Jungkook, an unspoken connection forming between them. "I'll stop by," Taehyung promised, his voice barely above a whisper. As he turned to leave, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was no ordinary encounter. Jungkook was more than just an artist, and Taehyung was determined to uncover the truth. Days later, Taehyung found himself standing in front of Jungkook's studio. The building was small, unassuming, and tucked away on a quiet street, just the kind of place where secrets could be kept. Jungkook greeted him at the door with a shy smile, his hair slightly messy from hours of work. The warmth in his gaze was something Taehyung had come to look forward to, even though he couldn't quite explain why. There was a quiet sadness in Jungkook's eyes, but also a glimmer of something else, something Taehyung couldn't quite name. As Taehyung stepped inside, he was struck by the sight of the studio. The walls were covered in paintings, each one unique, each one telling a different story. It was a reflection of the artist, passionate, complex, and enigmatic. "So, what do you think?" Jungkook asked, his voice a little uncertain as he watched Taehyung take in the space. "It's amazing," Taehyung replied. "Your art speaks to something deeper. It's not just about colors and shapes, it's about the emotions behind them." Jungkook's cheeks flushed slightly, clearly pleased by the compliment. "I'm glad you think so. Art is the only way I know how to express myself." Before Taehyung could respond, the door opened and Jaemin stepped inside, carrying coffee and pastries. Well, what do we have here?" Jaemin teased, shooting Taehyung a knowing look. Jungkook looked flustered but quickly recovered. "It's nothing, really. Taehyung was just admiring my work." Jaemin shot Taehyung a grin, clearly sensing that there was more to the story. "Ah, I see," he said, taking a seat. "I'll just leave you two to it then." It wasn't long before Yoongi entered, his presence commanding yet calm. His gaze softened when he saw Jaemin, his affection for him clear in the way he interacted with him. But Taehyung noticed something else. Yoongi's eyes briefly flicked toward him, and there was a knowing look there, as though Yoongi understood something that Taehyung didn't. "So, you are the famous artist, huh?" Yoongi asked, sipping his coffee. "And the spy everyone whispers about," he added with a grin, looking directly at Taehyung. Taehyung raised an eyebrow. "Only to those who know where to look." Jaemin chuckled, clearly amused by the exchange. "You two will get along just fine," he said. As the days passed, Taehyung found himself drawn deeper into Jungkook's world. The artist's studio became a regular part of his routine. They would spend hours together, talking about art, life, and everything in between. Taehyung couldn't help but feel a growing affection for Jungkook, a connection that went beyond mere attraction. But there was something else lurking in the background, something Taehyung couldn't ignore. Jungkook's tattoo, the crescent moon and star on his wrist, kept calling to him. It was a symbol he recognized, a symbol tied to the very organization he was investigating. One evening, as they worked side by side, Taehyung decided it was time to confront Jungkook. He had to know the truth. "Your tattoo," Taehyung began carefully, his voice low. "It's not just a design, is it?" Jungkook froze, his brush hovering over the canvas. "What are you talking about? Who are you really, Jungkook?" Taehyung pressed, his voice steady but insistent. Jungkook sighed, his shoulders sagging in defeat. "I didn't want you to know. But yes, my family is involved in the organization you're hunting. I didn't want to get you caught up in this." The admission was like a punch to the gut. Taehyung had grown fond of Jungkook, perhaps even more than he had intended. But this revelation complicated everything. "I never wanted you to get hurt," Jungkook added, his voice almost pleading. "But I can't lie anymore." Taehyung took a deep breath, his heart heavy. "I never asked for this, but my feelings for you, they haven't changed." Jungkook's eyes softened and he took a tentative step forward. "Taehyung." For a moment, there was silence between them. Then Taehyung spoke, his words quiet but filled with resolve. "We'll figure this out together." When Namjoon, their handler, found out about the situation, he wasn't angry or upset. Instead, he listened carefully, his expression unreadable. "So, Jungkook," Namjoon began, his voice calm but firm. "Can you keep this a secret? For Taehyung's sake?" Jungkook nodded without hesitation. "I won't tell anyone. I promise." Taehyung was surprised at how easily Jungkook had agreed. He had expected more resistance, more hesitation. But the sincerity in Jungkook's voice made it clear that he was fully committed to Taehyung. "Good," Namjoon said, his gaze shifting between the two. "We can work with this. Just make sure you keep this between us." Jungkook and Taehyung exchanged a brief glance, both knowing the gravity of the promise they had made. Meanwhile, Yoonji, who had known about Jimin's involvement as a spy from the very beginning, kept his word. He had never told anyone, honoring the promise he made to Jimin. The trust between the two was unshakable. The final mission was coming up. Taehyung, Jimin, and Jungkook were all on edge, knowing that this operation would decide the fate of many. The rogue organization had been hunting them for months, and now the time had come to end it. The target was a high-ranking member of the organization, someone who had been pulling the strings behind the scenes. It was a dangerous mission, but one they had no choice but to complete. Jimin and Taehyung moved in the shadows, while Jungkook was their inside man. The plan was set, and every detail had been meticulously planned. Yet, as they closed in on their target, Taehyung couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. After the mission's success, Taehyung found himself standing on a rooftop, staring at the moon. The cool breeze brushed past him as he closed his eyes and let the moment sink in. The mission was over, and the organization had been dismantled, but his thoughts kept returning to Jungkook. Jungkook joined him moments later, his steps quiet and graceful. The moonlight bathed him in its glow, highlighting the contours of his face and the sadness in his eyes. "We made it through," Taehyung said softly, his voice carrying the weight of everything they had endured. Jungkook nodded, his hand brushing against Taehyung's. Together, for a moment, they simply stood there, watching the moon as it illuminated the world below. No more secrets, no more lies, just the two of them, and the future they would build. In another part of the city, Jimin and Yoonji were standing together, their eyes fixed on the same moon that Taehyung and Jungkook were watching. The moonlight cast a soft glow over their faces, a symbol of the peace they had fought so hard to achieve. "I think we're finally free," Jimin said, his voice full of relief. Yoonji smiled, wrapping an arm around Jimin's waist. "We are. We've earned it." The two couples, though separated by distance, were united by the same moon. The mission was over, and they were free at last. As the night wore on, Taehyung and Jungkook remained on the rooftop, the moonlight casting a soft glow over them. Taehyung turned to Jungkook, his gaze filled with unspoken emotions. "We've been through so much," he said softly. Jungkook nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "And we'll face whatever comes next, together." Without a word, Taehyung closed the gap between them, his hand gently cupping Jungkook's face. Their lips met in a tender kiss, slow and meaningful, as if sealing a silent promise. When they pulled apart, they stayed close, foreheads touching, their breaths mingling in the cool night air. "No more secrets," Taehyung murmured. Jungkook smiled. "Only us." Double quotes. As they turned back to the moonlit sky, their hands intertwined, ready for whatever the future held.